They said he died choking. Not from rope, not from fire, but from his own blood filling his throat until he drowned on dry land. His face purple, his hands clawing desperately at his neck as his lungs refused him breath. And standing above him, silent as judgment, was Amara, the enslaved woman he had beaten, humiliated, and thought he owned. That image, whispered across the plantations of Georgia, spread like wildfire. Some claimed it was a curse. Others said it was vengeance from heaven itself. But those who had seen it with their own eyes knew the truth. Amara was no specter, no spirit. She was flesh and blood, a woman who had suffered long enough, and who chose to end her suffering in the most merciless way imaginable. For generations, enslaved men and women were told that resistance was futile, that the overseer's whip was stronger than their will. But Amara shattered that illusion. The night the overseer drowned in his own blood, she forced everyone enslaved and free alike to see that even the most brutal tyrant could fall, choking on the very violence he had once inflicted. The tale begins in Georgia, in the early years of the 18th century, a land of sprawling plantations, where sugar, rice, and cotton flowed like rivers of gold for the masters, and where rivers of sweat and tears flowed for the enslaved. Overseers ruled these plantations with unchecked cruelty. They were not men of honor but men of violence, rewarded for breaking bodies and crushing spirits. And among them was the one who believed Amara to be his possession, his object of torment. But he miscalculated. Because Amara's silence was not weakness, it was patience. Behind her lowered eyes, a storm was gathering, and when it broke, it would drown him, not in water, but in his own lifeblood. This is the story of Amara of Georgia, the enslaved woman who refused to die quietly, who turned fear into fury, and who made her overseer choke on the last thing he ever thought possible, his own mortality. Amara's name was not written in the ledgers of the plantation. To her master and to the overseer, she was nothing more than property, a number among dozens, a body counted for labor at dawn and punished at dusk. But among the enslaved, her name carried weight. Amara. A name whispered with respect. Even before the night she changed everything. She had been born into bondage, in the red soil of Georgia. Her earliest memories were not of freedom, but of fields stretching endlessly, and of hands, her mother's hands, guiding her through rows of sugarcane, teaching her how to endure the sun's merciless gaze. Her father, she never knew. Some said he was sold before she could walk. Others said he was killed after refusing an order. Such was the way of things. Families torn apart like weeds pulled from the earth. From childhood, Amara grew strong. Her body carried burdens that would have broken others, yet she endured. She learned to lift, to bend, to run when the whip cracked behind her. But more than strength, she learned silence. In a world where every word could be twisted into defiance, she spoke little. She let her eyes, sharp and steady, say what her mouth could not. But the overseer noticed her. He always noticed. He was a man who thrived on power, who fed on fear, who enjoyed reminding the enslaved that their bodies belonged to him. He singled Amara out often, not only for her strength but for her spirit. When she worked faster than the others, he accused her of arrogance. When she faltered, he accused her of laziness. And when she stood in silence, he struck her for insolence. Her back carried scars like rivers, each one carved by his hand. Yet, Amara did not break. She did not scream as he demanded. She did not beg. She held her silence as tightly as a blade hidden beneath cloth. And though the overseer thought this silence meant submission, he was blind to what it truly was. The patience of a woman who was waiting, watching. The other enslaved whispered of her courage in hushed tones. They saw how she endured the blows, how she lifted the weight of others when they collapsed, how she placed her body between the overseer and the younger ones he sought to strike. Some said she had the heart of a warrior, that her blood carried the memory of ancestors who had once fought with spear and shield on distant shores. Others simply believed she was touched by something greater, a spirit of resistance that could not be extinguished. But Amara herself did not think in such terms. She did not dream of being a legend. She only knew pain, and the burning ember inside her that refused to go out. With every lash, with every humiliation, with every night spent in the dark corners of the quarters, she felt that ember grow. The overseer thought he was bending her to his will. He did not realize he was forging her into steel. And so, the woman who seemed silent, broken, and obedient was, in truth, gathering strength. Every scar, Every drop of sweat, every tear shed in silence, was fuel for the storm she was becoming. And when that storm finally broke, it would not be Amara who drowned. To understand Amara's story, one must first understand the world that shaped it. Georgia, in the early 1700s, a colony still young, but already soaked in sweat, blood, and fear. Plantations stretched across the land, their fields heavy with rice, indigo, and later cotton. These crops filled the pockets of the masters with gold, but the wealth came at a terrible price. Enslaved Africans were dragged across oceans in chains, sold on the docks of Savannah and Charleston, and driven into the soil of Georgia like beasts of burden. For every bale of cotton, for every barrel of rice, there were backs broken, families shattered, lives consumed. At the heart of this brutal system stood the overseer. He was not a nobleman, nor a gentleman of honor. He was a man paid to break others, to ensure that no enslaved body dared to resist the will of the master. Overseers wielded whips and pistols like extensions of their own hands. Their authority was absolute. If an enslaved person faltered, they were beaten. If they resisted, they were maimed. If they ran, they were hunted like animals. The law itself stood with the overseer. Courts did not recognize the testimony of the enslaved. No one was punished for cruelty inflicted on them. To the world beyond the plantation, their pain did not exist. That silence gave overseers the freedom to unleash their worst impulses without fear, and unleash them they did. Overseers were feared not only for their violence, but for their appetites. Many preyed on the women they controlled, using rape as another tool of domination. Others inflicted elaborate punishments to feed their own sadism, tying men to posts until their skin peeled, burning hands in fire, forcing children to watch as their mothers were whipped. Terror was not simply a method of control, it was entertainment. Religion, twisted by hypocrisy, gave cover to it all. The same men who prayed in church on Sunday, reciting scripture with solemn faces, returned on Monday to demand labor at the crack of a whip. The Bible was quoted to enforce obedience, while its words of mercy were conveniently forgotten. And so, the enslaved lived in a world where cruelty was holy, and resistance was branded as sin. This was the world Amara walked in. Every sunrise brought the weight of chains, every sunset the threat of punishment. The overseer who tormented her was not an exception. He was the rule, the embodiment of a system designed to crush spirit as much as body. But Amara, unlike so many, refused to be crushed. She carried in her silence the knowledge that overseers bled like any other man. That they could fall, choke, and die, just as easily as those they tormented. And when that day came, the very structure of power so carefully built on violence and silence would tremble. The overseer's cruelty toward Amara did not soften with time. If anything, it grew sharper, more deliberate, as though he sensed that breaking her would bring him a satisfaction he could not find elsewhere. He watched her constantly. In the fields, under the scorching Georgia sun, he singled her out for punishment. If the work slowed, he lashed her first. If tools were misplaced, he accused her of carelessness. If another enslaved person faltered, he forced Amara to bear the punishment in their place. He was determined to make her an example and emblem of what happened to anyone who resisted, even silently. But Amara's silence infuriated him. When he struck her, she did not cry out. When he mocked her, she did not bow her head. She endured, her back straight, her eyes steady. It was as though her very refusal to shatter was a defiance greater than any words could have been, and for that, he despised her. There were nights when his cruelty took darker forms. He prowled the quarters like a predator, dragging women from their beds. The sound of doors being kicked open in the night was enough to silence all whispers, enough to make children hide their faces in the straw. And when his shadow fell across Amara's doorway, she knew that he did not only wish to punish her body, he wanted to consume her spirit. But Amara endured even that. She did not yield. Her scars deepened, but her ember of resistance burned hotter. The more he tried to break her, the more he revealed his own weakness, his need for her suffering to feel powerful. And the other enslaved saw it. They began to watch her with new eyes. In her endurance they saw defiance. In her silence they saw courage. Mothers whispered her name to their children as if it carried protection. Men glanced at her and felt that perhaps not all strength had been stolen from them. Amara was no longer only one woman among many, she was becoming a symbol, a quiet reminder that even under chains, the spirit could refuse to die. The overseer noticed this too, and it terrified him. Her very existence, unbroken, was an insult to his authority. He grew more reckless, more brutal, desperate to reassert control. Each lash of his whip was not just punishment, it was fear disguised as power. He wanted her silence to end in screams. He wanted her eyes to finally drop to the ground. But Amara's eyes did not fall. They locked on his, unflinching. And in that stare was the promise of something he could not yet see. A reckoning. And so, on the blood-soaked soil of the Georgia plantation, the tension coiled tighter and tighter, overseer and enslaved woman, predator and prey, or so it seemed. Yet beneath the surface, roles were shifting. The predator had revealed his vulnerability, his need for domination. And the prey was waiting, patient as the blade in its sheath, for the moment when patience would become vengeance. Something in Amara began to change. She had lived her entire life in the shadow of pain, her body marked by scars, her nights haunted by the overseer's cruelty. But pain, she realized, could be transformed. It could harden, sharpen, become something more than suffering. It could become resolve. At first, it was a flicker barely noticeable even to herself. The thought that fear was not only a weapon in the hands of the overseer, but also in hers. She saw how the others looked at her, how even in silence they seemed to draw strength from her endurance. And she understood something the overseer never would. Power did not always come from the lash. Sometimes, it came from refusing to bend. Amara began to observe him closely, not with the eyes of a victim, but with the eyes of a hunter. She noted his habits, the way he strutted through the fields in the morning, the way he drank heavily at dusk, the way his temper flared quickest when he felt ignored. She studied his weaknesses, the slur in his speech after too much rum, the arrogance that left him alone at night, convinced no one dared touch him. Her silence became strategy. Each word she withheld was not submission, but control. By speaking little, she gave him nothing to use, nothing to twist, nothing to break. And in that emptiness, she built her strength. The ember inside her grew into fire. No longer did she dream only of surviving the next lash, the next night, the next dawn. Now, she dreamed of ending him, of watching the man who had stolen so much her dignity, her peace, her body brought low, gasping and broken. The transformation did not happen overnight. It came in small acts of defiance that only she knew. The way she stood taller when he struck her. The way she held his gaze a moment longer. The way she began to smile, faintly, when he grew frustrated at her unbroken spirit. Each gesture was a rehearsal for the moment to come. And deep within she made a vow. She would not die in chains. She would not vanish nameless into the soil. She would not let the overseer's cruelty define the end of her story. Instead, she would turn his violence back upon him. She would make his body betray him, make his own blood become his executioner. Amara had crossed a threshold. She was no longer the hunted. She was waiting, patient, certain. The overseer believed he still held power. He had no idea that the woman he tried to break was no longer prey. She had become the storm gathering in silence, preparing to strike. Amara's plan was not born in a single night. It took shape slowly, in shadows and silence, pieced together from the overseer's arrogance and his blindness. She knew he thought himself untouchable. He strutted about the plantation, whip at his side, pistol at his belt, convinced that the law, the master, and even God stood with him. He never imagined that the woman whose back bore his scars could also be the one plotting his end. The first step was patience. Amara waited for his routine to betray him. She knew he drank heavily at dusk, the bottle always within reach as he sat on the porch of the overseer's quarters. She knew his footsteps staggered on those nights, his voice slurred, his grip on his pistol loose. She knew, too, that his temper often drew him away from the safety of others, seeking out solitary moments of cruelty. Then came the moment to lure him. Amara let him believe he still controlled her. She lowered her gaze when he passed, bent her shoulders under his blows, made herself appear smaller, weaker, broken. Each gesture fed his confidence. Each silence whispered to him, "You have won." And so, when the night came that she offered no resistance as he dragged her toward the edge of the fields, he thought nothing of it. He thought it was routine. But Amara had chosen the ground. Not the fields, not the quarters, but near the edge of the swamp, where the earth was soft, the air thick, and no one came after dark. The cicadas shrieked in the trees, the water bubbled in the distance, and the smell of damp rot clung to the air. It was the kind of place where screams could vanish into the night without echo. When his hands grabbed her, when his mouth spat insults, when his whip struck her skin, Amara did not resist. She waited for the exact moment when his arrogance made him sloppy, when his rage blinded him. And then, with a suddenness that startled even herself, she struck. She turned on him with the force of years of buried fury. Her hand found the jagged shard of glass she had hidden in the hem of her dress, broken from a discarded bottle days before, sharpened against stone until it gleamed like a blade. With a single motion, she drove it into his throat. The overseer staggered back, shock written across his face. He clutched at the wound, but the blood came fast, hot, unstoppable. He tried to shout, but only a wet gurgle escaped his lips. His eyes widened as he realized what was happening, that the woman he had thought powerless now held his life in her hands. Amara did not run. She did not weep. She watched him struggle, every movement feeding the wound, every gasp pulling more blood into his lungs. He fell to his knees, choking, coughing, his body betraying him. The man who had forced so many to bow was now drowning in his own blood. And Amara stood over him, steady, her silence louder than any scream. The night split open with the sound of choking. The overseer fell back into the mud, his hands clawing desperately at his throat, trying to stop the river of blood that poured from him. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, each one wetter than the last, as if the air itself was turning to liquid inside his lungs. He coughed violently, and crimson sprayed across his chest, staining the soil beneath him. His eyes bulged in disbelief. He had been struck before in drunken brawls or hunting accidents, but never like this. This was not a wound to be bandaged. This was death crawling up his throat, filling his mouth, drowning him from the inside. Amara stood above him, motionless, her breathing steady. She did not flinch as he writhed at her feet, did not recoil from the gurgling sounds, from the bubbling foam of red that spilled past his lips. For every moment of agony he endured, she remembered the nights he had dragged her into the dark. For every convulsion of his body, she remembered the cries of children he had whipped. For every desperate gasp, she remembered the silence he had forced upon her. And she did not look away. The overseer tried to rise, staggering onto his knees, reaching for her with trembling hands. But the strength drained from him as quickly as the blood. He toppled forward, face striking the earth, choking again as mud mixed with the stream that gushed from his throat. His own body was betraying him, suffocating him in the very blood he had spilled from others. From the shadows of the quarters, a few enslaved men and women had gathered silently. They had followed the sounds, curious, fearful. Now they stood frozen, watching the overseer's end. None spoke. None dared intervene. But in their eyes, glimmers of shock mixed with something else, something like awe. The overseer rolled onto his back, his chest heaving, his mouth opening wide in a soundless scream. His last breaths rattled in his throat, thick and bubbling. And then, with one final convulsion, his body went still. The night was silent, save for the croak of frogs and the hum of cicadas. The overseer lay lifeless in the mud, his face twisted in terror, his throat a ruin. The man who had believed himself untouchable, the man who thought fear would protect him forever, had drowned in his own blood. Amara remained standing, her figure tall and unbroken against the moonless sky. She did not cry, she did not smile. She simply breathed, free of fear, while those who watched understood what had just happened. A line had been crossed. The overseer was gone, and Amara was the one who had ended him. For the enslaved who witnessed it, that night would never leave them. They had seen the impossible, a woman, armed only with her patience and her rage, bring down the very embodiment of their suffering. His death was not only an end, it was a beginning. By dawn, the overseer's body was gone. Some said the master ordered it buried in secret, his throat wrapped hastily in cloth, so no one would ask questions. Others whispered that the enslaved dragged him into the swamp, leaving him for the alligators and the mud to consume. Whatever the truth, no grave marked his name, no prayer was spoken for his soul. His end was as brutal and as silent as the life he had inflicted on others. But Amara, her fate became legend. Some swore she was captured days later, whipped until her body broke, then hanged as an example. Yet no record exists. Others insisted she escaped into the swamps, joining the maroon communities that thrived beyond the reach of chains, her figure seen in the mist like a spirit of vengeance. And still others believed she never left at all, that she moved like a shadow through the plantations, a warning that overseers whispered about in fear. The enslaved carried her story in whispers. Around fires at night, in hushed voices in the fields, they told of Amara, the woman who forced her overseer to drown in his own blood. For the children, it was a tale of courage. For the elders, it was a reminder that even the cruelest tyrant was mortal. And for the masters and overseers, it became a rumor that unsettled their sleep, proof that their power could be shattered. Amara's silence had once been mistaken for submission. In the end, it was her greatest weapon. She showed that vengeance did not always come with fire or rebellion. Sometimes, it came in a single, precise strike that turned cruelty back upon itself. And so her story lingers, centuries later. Not in official records, not in the books written by those who claim to control history, but in the breath of those who remembered. In Georgia, in the fields once drenched in blood and sweat, her name still drifts like smoke. Amara, the enslaved woman who turned patience into fury, the victim who became predator, the shadow who stood tall as her overseer drowned in his own blood. And the question her story leaves behind has no easy answer. Was she a murderer, or was she justice made flesh?